the argument that cold weather disproves that global warming exists, that's the same logic as saying that nighttime proves that the sun doesn't exist.
Hi everyone, and welcome to a special holidays episode of the Environment in Canada podcast. Today's episode is about tips and tricks for those difficult holiday environmental conversations. I'm your host, Connor Curtis, and this will be the first of 2 episodes for the holidays. And it's a season when hopefully you're getting time to spend with family and friends, to relax, and to do the things you love. For me, that means writing some truly ridiculous holidays music for the podcast, catching up on my cooking skills, and spending some time with the people around me. But however you choose to spend your holidays, somewhere midway through dinner, there will probably be a conversation that someone will bring up about the environment, climate change, or some other seemingly tough issue. I say seemingly because I think we've partially been purposefully misled into thinking climate action and climate issues specifically will be a tough issue to discuss with family and friends, when it doesn't have to be. I'm going to focus today's podcast on climate change and policy because that's what I'm personally best versed in, but the things I'm mentioning here could really be applied to any environmental issue. And before I get into how we talk about these issues, I want you to first internalize 2 simple truths. Firstly, you are not alone. If you're concerned about climate change, then you should know that according to polling by Abacus Data via Environmental Defense, conducted in late November and early December, 53% of Canadians want governments to phase out the use and production of fossil fuels, and only 36% of Canadians oppose a phase out. Further, only 35% of Canadians have any degree of trust left in oil and gas companies. And all of this is considering all those big advertising spends by the Pathways Alliance and the Alberta government trying to convince us all that oil and gas was such a good thing. That goes against all of the arguments about why we need to be quote-unquote practical about climate change in the current moment. There are a lot of people out there who either agree with you on some aspect of climate change issues, or who are on the fence. The second thing I want you to think about is that we don't have to agree on everything to agree on some very important things. Maybe you're someone who thinks big corporations should pull their weight on emissions reductions, but isn't necessarily in agreement about phasing out oil and gas entirely. Maybe you'd like to see an emissions cap put on wealthy oil and gas corporations so they at least have to do the same work as the rest of us. Well, again, according to different polling, the majority of Canadians aware of the policy, 67%, think an emissions cap will either have a significant or some impact on climate goals. Further, 65% either support the cap or say it's a question of the implementation being right, while only 32% actually oppose it. That's true even in Alberta, where 45% of people actually oppose the cap. When you think about the millions of taxpayer dollars the Alberta government wasted in their PR campaign against the emissions cap, not even convincing half of the Albertan public to oppose the emissions cap is a pretty bad result. In Atlantic Canada, only 22% of people oppose the emissions cap. The point is, we don't have to agree on everything to agree corporations should pull their weight on pollution. And if you're climate concerned at all, you're not alone. It doesn't matter whether you're depending on oil and gas for work, energy, or transportation, anyone can help hold the biggest polluters accountable to their promises. Though we can do individual things to help the environment, it's not about personal lifestyles, because we know that personal lifestyles have very little actual impact in terms of environmental action. It's the big systemic changes, the corporate changes that we need most. So it's a good idea to reach out to others, to talk to them. And in fact, it's the most powerful thing you can do. Not only that, but you'll probably find that there are a lot of people on the same page about a lot of the basics. But how we go about conversations on climate change is where things get tricky. I want to share with you 4 steps to have better conversations on climate change this holiday season and in general. Again, these are things that I'm going to specifically focus on climate change in this context in order to demonstrate, but could apply these to any issue of the environment. First thing, focus on talking with people who are actually on the fence. Not people who already agree with you, and not people who will never agree with you. People on the fence. That's where your energy needs to go. There's really very little point in wasting a lot of time talking to somebody who just isn't going to agree with you, who just wants to get a rise out of you or wants to frustrate you. Because really what they're trying to do is actually waste your time.
And that's actually because they probably realize just how valuable it would be if instead you were talking to somebody who maybe you could convince about the seriousness of climate change and the need for action. And if you're in a room full of different people with very different places on that spectrum, well then it should sort of be a guide to who to maybe focus your attention on. Again, remember, you're maybe not speaking to the climate denier in the room. Maybe you're speaking to all the people who are listening to them and to you.
At the same point, if you only ever talk to people who agree with you on everything, well, then 1, you're not going to convince anybody else that climate change is a serious concern, and 2, there are things that you can learn from talking to people who maybe don't agree with you on everything that are going to be important, that are going to improve your perspective as well. It can be a dialogue. Point number 2, when engaging with a climate conversation. Instead of starting at the end of the conversation, start at the beginning. When talking to others, ask them what concerns them about environmental destruction and climate change. What is it that affects them? Get them to share their story and their take on it. And get them to focus on the actual impacts, because it's something we don't discuss enough, but that a lot of Canadians say they experience.
And these concerns need not just be about humans, as Louise Comeau pointed out on an earlier episode of the podcast.
But in particular, this interesting group I talked about, this 21% of the Canadian population that is socially conservative, but very concerned about climate change, their pathway into the issue is actually through nature and through their love of animals.
Then there's step number 3.
Share what concerns you, and share the personal stories of what concerns you, why climate change is personally scary to you, and what you personally feel about it. Because, again, we can chat about facts and figures and policies all we want, but unless we actually make a connection with other people, unless we establish a baseline of where we're both coming from, that conversation probably isn't going to go very far. Step number 4 is to share your passion for solutions. Part of the reason we see these big advertising campaigns to try and crush things like the emissions cap is because they want to crush people who believe in solutions. They want you, as somebody who maybe cares about the issue, who thinks that there's a solution out there, to feel bad about talking to other people about it, to feel like you're alone. That's the primary goal of campaigns like that, misinformation campaigns. It's not so much to directly convince the public, but it's to convince all the advocates for solutions to stay silent. So don't stay silent. Talk about solutions. Share your passion for solutions. The emissions cap is one that almost anybody can agree upon because it really is just about holding corporations to its promises. And it's about fixing a problem. Again, we're going to talk in a little bit about blame here. But really, when we talk about the majority of the work that needs to be done on climate action or environment or anything else, we are talking about big corporations. There's nothing really to be gained in fighting amongst ourselves as individuals over these issues. Okay, so if you've got those 4 steps, there are some other things to consider. In talking to other people, never accept a frame that's going to ultimately defeat any sort of action whatsoever. I'll give you an example. We often hear a lot of things about why climate action is impractical or it's not the right time for it. And the simple reality is that the same people who have said that now are the same people who have been saying it for years. And one simple thing to do is just point out that that's just a rehearsed argument. We hear it every time people want to act on climate change, and things keep getting worse because it keeps getting delayed. There's nothing practical about holding back on climate action, especially when there's lots of easy things we could be doing, like holding corporations accountable to their pollution. There is a lot of stuff we could be doing. So saying climate action is impractical, well, what climate action exactly? It's not the right time, well, what climate action exactly? Because the other thing to keep in mind is adaptation is not enough. Average world incomes will drop by almost a fifth within the next 26 years as a result of the climate crisis, and the costs of damage will be 6 times higher than the price of limiting global heating to 2 degrees centigrade. So if that cost is so much higher in the future, why would we not act now? A simple way to visualize this is, why would we let ourselves get crushed by a falling tree when we could easily step out of the way? When you see a car coming towards you, do you move aside, or do you stand still on the path of the car and call an ambulance for what's going to happen afterwards? That's why it's so practical to work on climate change now and to not push it aside. You're going to hear a lot of things probably around the political theater that we tend to see in Canadian politics and politics all over the world. And sure, it's important, but we don't want to become so obsessed with what's going on the political stage, and it is a stage, that we forget to ask and to talk about what it is that we actually believe in. We've forgotten to talk about solutions in a practical sense. And that's dangerous, because political theater really is a show. It's a shadow cast on society by business. And the only way to truly address the underlying issues is to come together around ideas, solutions, and basic concepts like fairness. Only from that starting point can we fix anything. It's not about politics, and it's not about the politics that particularly does come to resemble a sports game without the enjoyment of actually watching a sport. Most people hold varying views on things, and we need to get back to fundamental concepts, again, like fairness. That's part of why we put so much emphasis on the idea of an emissions cap. Not because it's a singular solution to climate change, not even because it's just one policy, but because it embodies a concept that the biggest polluters should be accountable, that what we do on climate change should be fair. And it's a powerful concept. Ideas hold a lot of power. They hold more power ultimately in the long run than political theater does. And even in the short term, if we want to move past the political theater and get to addressing solutions, we need to refocus what we're doing on the solutions and on the discussions of what matters. Because we do ultimately all probably share similar concern. We are concerned about the future. We're concerned about our families. And this will tie into another false dichotomy. That's all or nothing. Well, if somebody says to you that we can't do anything on climate change, that in order to do something on climate change, we'd have to turn off all the taps of everything that we use that's related to oil and gas, really, is that real? I mean, surely that person can agree that if we can make the situation a little bit better, we should. And if we can do so easily, we should. Chat to them about that, because it can't be all or nothing. I mean, at the end of the day, the basic question is there. Do you want things to get better, or do you not? Things will always be not perfect, as there is no such thing as perfect environmental balance. We will always struggle with that to some degree, but there's a lot that we can do in order to reduce pollution, in order to move to circular economies, in order to create systems that are better. And we shouldn't be held back by somebody saying, well, it's all or nothing, because I say so. Another thing that you deal with is the notion of some sort of economic apocalypse that apparently will result from any form of environmental regulation. Well, we have a ton of other regulations. Did they cause an economic apocalypse? Did seatbelts cause one? Do food safety standards cause one? Do regulations to ensure worker safety cause economic apocalypses? Even if you buy into the idea that necessarily a regulation has to be bad for the economy, which is not always the case, even then, how bad? I mean, when we really talk about something like an emissions cap, we know that the actual impact on the economy is extremely minimal. We've dealt with that in a previous podcast where we sat down with an economist and we talked about it. And we talked about some of the fear-mongering that's happened around it. It's not really any different from any other sort of regulation, and these regulations are specific to industries. That's one example that I'm using in this, but there are lots of other environmental regulations that you can argue follow a similar concept. They're not the be-all and end-all of our economy. They're not the scapegoat. They're not the issue. The real thing that is costing people are massive profits earned by oil and gas corporations. It's 25 cents of every additional dollar of inflation that's going to oil and gas and mining profits. Those companies made over $10 billion in Canada in this year alone, in the first half of the year, in fact. So that's really what's hurting us, is this reliance upon oil and gas that we haven't shifted off of at any sort of reasonable speed. And it's not a good thing to rely upon. If we really want to talk about avoiding economic catastrophe, we should be reliant on things that are more stable. The problem that we will run into if we fail to do that is that other countries are going to shift off of oil and gas dependency. They already are. Again, they may not even be doing this because they care about climate change. They may be doing this simply because it's better to be reliant upon renewable energy. It's more efficient, it's often more reliable, and it's something that you can actually install locally and you can control versus having to be dependent upon these global markets. And it comes back to another thing, because the more we delay on climate action, the more we delay renewable energy, well, again, the further we fall behind, because any form of energy will have some dependency, at least in the initial stage, on building up resources internationally. And if we are falling completely behind, we don't control any of the supply chain for renewable energy in this country, well, then we are going to end up as dependent as before on a new form of energy. That doesn't have to be the case. Eventually it won't be the case. But if we want to really avoid any sort of economic trouble, we need to be rapidly moving to renewables. And doing so in a way that actually centers communities, rather than dismissing them, as the oil and gas development of the previous decades did often dismiss communities. We have to change the way we do energy, and we have to work with communities to give them the power over it.
And so another common line you're going to hear is, why should Canada do anything on climate change? What about China and India? What about these other countries? Shouldn't they be the ones acting? They have so much more emissions. Well, here's your standard response to that, of course, is, well, we have much higher per capita emissions. So per person, it's a bit like saying, I have 2 loaves of bread as an individual. Oh, look at that person over there with 10 other people. They have 4 loaves of bread, but they're splitting those 4 loaves of bread amongst 10 people. And then it's as if you turn around and you say, my God, they have so much bread, but you have 2 loaves for one person. That's kind of a simple analogy for why per capita emissions, per person emissions matter more than the total emissions of a country. There's also legacy emissions. Of course, Canada's been emitting for a lot longer than a lot of other countries. But even more than that is simply the point that other countries are taking action on climate change. Other countries are, in fact, putting in an effort here. The UAE is even considering an EU-style plan to go after big polluters for the first time. There are lots of other countries making huge progress on renewables. And again, if this person that you're talking to is really a nationalist, really cares about Canada being number one and staying ahead of others, well, my concern would be renewable energy.
A lot of the world
that looks to China as the leader in a lot of ways for energy, because China is investing heavily in renewables. If you want to compete and stay competitive as a country, that's where the game is being played. It's not being played with oil and gas anymore. And the only people really profiting off of oil and gas are a few people at the very top of oil and gas companies. When we actually look at the breakdown of where those profits go to, the profits you're paying for inflation, a lot of those, in the United States, over 50%, are going to the top 1% of people. The richest 1% are gaining all those profits. Very little is actually going to things like pension funds. Again, this is just economic nonsense.
It's a bit like saying the US should have competed with the Soviet Union in the space race by not building rockets at all and going back to building biplanes. The rockets in this case being renewable energy and the biplanes being oil and gas.
So saying it's practical or as pragmatic that Canada sits behind on emissions reductions is ridiculous, because we know actually when we put rules in place around emissions reductions, it spurs things like green innovation. It forces companies to hire for green jobs rather than just cutting a bunch of jobs, because again, when you regulate things, companies actually need to put some effort in. They can't just automate everything and leave it to function. They need to actually have people there. Just things to think about that, again, take the conversation from it's impractical to work on climate change to it is exactly practical to do this work on climate change.
And at the end of the day, what Canada does do on climate change does have an impact. Other countries look at what we're doing and think about doing the same things. Costa Rica is a good example of a country that, although it's had issues recently with some of its policies, has actually been ahead of Canada on a lot of environmental policy things. We have an earlier episode on that too. And there you have an instance of reframing the topic, because you're not challenging somebody's fundamental belief. Maybe they really believe in Canada. They really believe Canada should be ahead. But you're making it clear that the way we're talking about the topic is not the correct way. A lot of people will ask when talking to others, is it more important to use facts or feelings? And again, I wanted you to step back from that and just think about framing. The way we talk about things, the narrative, the sense of belonging that we have comes from a combination of two things, facts and feelings. It's how they intersect and how we think about them internally that determines our sense of self-identity. Nobody's sense of self-identity needs to be threatened by climate action. It's not about identity as an individual. It's about changing an energy system. It inevitably will be, because unfortunately those companies that develop oil and gas want people to believe that their entire identity, that their entire being is dependent upon their substance. That's a very powerful thing to wield as a corporation. If I can convince you that because you eat my brand of cookies, therefore any attack on my company is an attack on you, well, then I have a lot of power over you. And that's really a problem. We have to break the power corporations have over us.
And the first step is point that out. Say, listen, are you really going to sit there and say that these big corporations to have all this power should be beyond question, should be beyond doubt? Do you really think that you owe them all your loyalty? Do you really think that they feel that same loyalty to you? A lot of oil and gas corporations slashing jobs, not interested in hiring people, even when production takes an upturn. So do you really think that they have your back? So I want you instead to think in terms of framing. Understand the perspective and the identity of the person that you're talking to when you have a conversation. And try, instead of changing their whole being and identity, simply offering them something new, offering them something that's similar but a little different. Give them a way to support climate action that also is inclusive. It doesn't need to be yes or no to everything. If we can even agree on a few things, that's extremely powerful. That's a way forward. That's a way to start things. And that's a way to address the most serious issue of our time in many ways. One other thing that I'm going to talk about here is, of course, wildfires. And there's a lot of misinformation out there about how wildfires start and what the impact of climate change is. And we've dealt with this a little bit in previous episodes of the show. Think about this as if you're lighting a campfire. If you've got dry conditions and it's very dry weather, well, then the campfire is going to light more easily. And as soon as you light it, it's going to burn a lot brighter because the wood is dry, the conditions are dry, there's no rain. That's going to impact your campfire. Well, it's the same exact thing with a wildfire. If a spark is created, no matter where it comes from, some from lightning, some from human just negligence, or even just activities we can't really change, create sparks. No matter where that spark comes from, if it lands in hot, dry conditions, hotter, drier conditions than there would have been normally, the chances for a fire starting are much higher, and the conditions mean that the fire could be much more intense. And that's exactly what we're seeing with climate change. So that's another issue that just may come up, and that's one way to talk about it. Another thing that we didn't touch on that you may run into is the it's too late argument. And if you think about it, this is kind of the opposite of the it's too early to act argument, right? It's something that seems to be somewhat common to the environmental movement. It's something we internally do where we say everything is just doomed and we can't do anything about it. Well, what do you mean by it's too late? It's too late for what exactly? Sure, there will be a lot of environmental damage, but there are still a lot of lives hanging on what we do right now. Still a lot of people who are looking to us as a movement to do something effective in this moment for the future. Still a lot of things we can stop from getting worse than they would have gotten otherwise. So saying it's too late really doesn't mean anything. It's too late for what? It's too early for what? Both two sides of the same question. And again, it's coming down to creating a false dichotomy. Either we have to win every single climate fight, or we've lost all of them. That isn't the case. Overall, the shift to a greener future is happening. It's happening for pure reasons of economic. What we need to do most right now is accelerate it, is create an actual voice of people who are willing to go out there and say, I want to see change. I want to see action. Because every little thing we do is multiplied. It's not diminished. It's multiplied. And so everything that you do to create action makes a huge difference. What I want to do for the rest of the episode is play some clips from previous podcast episodes where we've discussed some of these different aspects. These are informative moments, and I hope that they help add some context to what I've been saying here. We've spent a lot of episodes dealing with this specific topic of how to communicate with others, precisely because we think it's so important that people learn that skill set. Because the most powerful thing, as I've said before, that you can possibly do for the environment right now is talk to other people about climate change and about climate action, and remind them that adaptation is not enough. We need to figure out a way to bring down pollution. Prevention is so much more important right now than we can ever possibly imagine. And I want to start by playing a clip from Montana Burgess of Neighbors United, who came on a webinar recently talking about their deep canvassing campaign and how they're going about talking to people on their doorsteps about environmental issues, because I think it's going to encapsulate some of the things we just discussed now.
So in Coquitlam, it's a suburb of Vancouver. If you've ever been to Coquitlam, let me know in the chat what your favorite thing about Coquitlam is. It's a suburban, pretty small C conservative place. And here we are deep canvassing to build enough support for a building standard for new buildings to be zero carbon with no new gas hookups. And the community here is very conflicted. You think this would be easy because this doesn't affect most people that already live there because it's about new buildings. But people have all sorts of misinformation, disinformation, or all sorts of other concerns. And here we've been effective at obtaining a 45% persuasion rate. So folks are moving with us. And in this deep canvas, the core belief we're trying to shift. So in each deep canvas, you identify what is the core belief that someone holds or the community holds that you need to shift within the conversation, because you can only shift one belief at a time as far as the research has shown. So here, the core belief is all electric buildings are not a better alternative to using gas. And we're trying to shift them to all electric buildings are a better alternative to using gas. And we've learned kind of three core things. The first, in a suburban community, it's quite different than a small town like Trail, where they don't have a clear-cut identity that's shared, and they don't have this pollution success story that the community is familiar with. So the common struggle that we've identified here is actually their struggle to adjust to the changing extreme weather. And in this deep canvas, again, we use a climate stake story. We help people get into their lived experience of how the smoke and the heat, how they're affecting folks, how they're affecting everyday people, and how we're experiencing changing climate, the changing climate, and how we're worried and how it's scary, or however that shows up for folks in their stories. The third piece is we learned, especially in this deep canvas, there's a lot of, I'd say a lot of disinformation specifically, but also misinformation. And here we've learned that when we get people in that lived experience with story sharing, we can cut through that. We have become the trusted messenger, and we can then offer a brief counterpoint if that is still a concern on their mind, and they are willing to hear it and wrestle with it in their own, when we give them the space to wrestle with their internal conflict. If we don't do that story sharing and that relationship building through the story sharing and hitting all those elements, they are not able to wrestle with the disinformation and misinformation. They just keep spouting off the same stuff. Another deep canvas we're running is in a couple of BC mill towns here in Castlegar, where I am, and also in Vernon. These are traditionally seen as mill towns. Now that is not the main economic driver, but it was in the past. And here we're deep canvassing to build support for a new law that's politically on the books for BC that would make ecosystem health the top priority for forestry management. And a lot of folks in British Columbia are quite concerned about our last remaining old growth forests. This is one way to get at defending what remains of them. So here we're deep canvassing. Our persuasion rate is 35.6%. And the core belief shift we're trying to make is taking people from thinking that prioritizing ecosystem health will be harmful to forestry workers to thinking that prioritizing ecosystem health will benefit the person that we are talking to, forestry workers, and their whole community. And so how we've done that is, first, we've learned we have to actually name what the law is called and what they're talking about as government and public, so people start to hear it in those words to become almost like inoculated and in knowing what it is. So we have to name it. We have to say biodiversity and ecosystem health law. The second learning is in these towns, voters do identify as having been or being part of the logging industry. And so, saying, our community has benefited from the logging industry, and that's okay. How have you benefited? But then helping people wrestle with how the logging companies are actually letting them down. Things aren't as good anymore as perhaps they used to be, or how they once had better jobs. They're not there in the same way anymore. There's more contractors, there's less union positions. It's a whole thing. And so helping people get into their lived experience in the bad deal that people are actually getting in their communities around logging companies and logging helps them understand that this isn't about them. This is about the companies making changes. And they get really frustrated when they realize how unfair it is. And finally, the last learning from this project is helping them understand that we can have a new kind of balance. Balance is a word that's been co-opted by the big logging industry. And we're kind of taking it back. We're saying we need a new balance. We need something that works for ecosystem health and for our communities and our economies. And people get that, and they want that. And they understand that things aren't going very well out there in the communities and in ecosystems. So this is moving folks.
Here's a clip of my co-host Jessica talking to John Cook, who's a specialist in climate misinformation. And he's going to talk more to the factual side, where Montana talked to maybe perhaps more the story, the initial connection-making side. John speaks to some of the ways you can factually explain things using simple analogies and a bit of humor.
The philosophers, they call it parallel argumentation. Another word for it or phrase for it is logic analogies. Basically, take the flawed logic in an argument or the fallacy and then transplant it into a parallel situation or an analogous situation. And this is my favorite way of explaining fallacies. And let me give you an example.
Yeah, definitely.
The argument that cold weather disproves that global warming exists, that's the same logic as saying that nighttime proves that the sun doesn't exist. They both commit anecdote fallacy. It's only looking at your immediate experience in that instant in time, in that place where you're standing, and ignoring what's the bigger picture. Another version of that argument, cold weather disproves global warming, is saying, I just had a meal and I'm feeling full, therefore global hunger doesn't exist.
Right. It definitely reduces it into some very crazy, silly thing. It also requires a bit of pure creativity, though. Kind of really showcase to people wait, but that's what your mind is actually doing. Do you see the issue now?
Yeah. And I think the creativity is actually why it's so powerful, because people often react the way you did, you just laugh because it's a ridiculous argument, but it's exactly the same logic as the original climate myth. And it's a very concrete, relatable and engaging and humorous way to debunk misinformation. The light bulb moment for me was realizing that this technique is used by late night comedians every night. They debunk something that a public figure said by saying, well, that's just like being in this situation. And then they use the same logic in an analogous situation. And everyone laughs. It's funny. It's entertaining. But it also explains how the original argument was false.
You really come at misinformation from this perspective of from what I perceive as ending kind of this idea of divisiveness, where it's oh, those dummies that have fallen for misinformation. It's a much more gracious attitude of you're an intelligent human being. You don't deserve to be fooled. And here's how, and it's not your fault. And I'm curious to know how you got to that point, because I think it's kind of an easy pitfall, especially in this age of call out culture and kind of being so quick to kind of call the other person wrong. I'm curious to know how you kind of came to that perspective.
I think that the data actually just kind of pushed me in that direction. When I did my first psych experiment testing inoculation approaches, what I found was this critical thinking approach, explaining misleading fallacies, was equally effective across the political spectrum. It neutralized the misinformation, whether people were politically conservative or politically liberal. And it really underscored to me how nobody likes being misled, whether you're conservative or liberal, whether you're Republican or Democrat. And the critical thinking approach also gave you the opportunity to kind of sidestep culturally charged issues like climate change, which is very polarized. You can use these parallel arguments, use these different examples of fallacies in a completely non-polarizing situation, and then that inoculates them against those techniques. What my first experiment found was when I explained the technique of fake experts using tobacco misinformation from the mid-20th century, a much less polarized topic than really ancient history topic from a 2020 point of view. Then I showed them climate misinformation. The climate misinformation was neutralized for both conservatives and liberals. So I managed to do an inoculation in a non-polarizing way by just sidestepping the climate change issue. And so that I guess that data is what opened my eyes to critical thinking is really powerful here. It's not just an approach to stopping climate misinformation. It's really a universal vaccine against misinformation.
Yeah, I really love that. That's really wonderful. Okay, so my last question actually is that a lot, I think, the basis of your work was founded on your own personal lived experience. That I think it was some of your family members who had started off not believing in climate science and were struggling with this misinformation. I'm curious to know, how does the story end? Or maybe the story is ongoing. How is that? Have they kind of
Yeah,
taken to your work?
the story is ongoing and the story never
Yeah.
ends, right? That's the theme of the day. Yeah, so I mentioned starting the website Skeptical Science earlier, but I didn't say why. It actually, the impetus for starting Skeptical Science was getting into arguments with my father-in-law about climate change. And like any son-in-law that doesn't want to lose an argument with their father-in-law, I started researching the topic, documenting, because I'm also a nerd, all the different climate myths that I might encounter the next time we got together and what the peer-reviewed science said about each climate myth so I could have a ready-made answer. And then I realized that this kind of resource is something that might be useful to anyone. That led to me publishing my research on skeptical science. I also had similar arguments with my father as well. So both father and father-in-law were having these climate arguments. And interestingly, both of those conversations have gone in different directions. My
Okay.
father ended up changing his mind and accepting the reality of climate change and human-caused global warming. My father-in-law hasn't. He's very much doubled down and distrustful, dismissive of climate science. And so I think that what that tells us is that, again, it's not a cookie cutter thing. There is no one path. There is no killer argument that will change anyone's minds. Everyone is different, and every conversation we have with a person can go in different ways. The thing that changed my father's mind about climate change wasn't some killer argument that I had or a killer fact that blew his mind away. Or, and I was doing a PhD about climate misinformation at the time that we were talking about this, and he changed his mind. What changed his mind was him getting solar panels. He, in the region where he lives, Queensland, Australia, they had a very generous solar rebate so that whenever he put solar power back into the grid, he got more money than he was paying for solar power, paying for electricity. And because Queensland, which is called the Sunshine State, was giving him so much solar power, he was basically not paying any electricity bill. He was getting a check from, rather than a bill every time that he got a letter from the electricity company. And so every 3 months when he got the electricity bill, he would call me up and say, guess how much I got, how much money I got this time. And my theory is that what changed his mind about climate change was not his beliefs changing first and then his behavior changing. Rather, his behavior changed first, for hip pocket reasons, as he liked to tell me. And then his beliefs shifted to come in line with his behavior. We always think that beliefs come first and then behavior. It can go in either direction. And I think in his case, it went in the other direction.
Thanks so much for joining today, and we hope you found this useful. And listen, holidays can be tough. They're beautiful times of the year, but they're also difficult. And if you're facing things that we didn't discuss here, difficult conversations, something that came up that you're not sure how to deal with, send us an email, info@sierraclub.ca. We'll be happy to answer your questions. And keep in mind, we may be away for a couple of days, but we will be checking info@sierraclub.ca if you want to reach out to us.
And if you'd like to support this podcast this holiday season and the work of Sierra Club Canada, please donate, if you are going to donate, online or by phone. Link and phone number will be in the description. We are standing in solidarity with workers at Canada Post. Also, before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and on CHMA Radio in Sackville, New Brunswick on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us. And now to end, here's some more of that holiday music with just a ridiculous amount of bells in it. Happy holidays, everyone.